So, I sent an email around to the regulars about asking for suggestions about things that I could talk about. I could just get up here and talk about, the stuff that I'm interested in, but that wouldn't necessarily be very useful. So that's what I was asking for. What would be beneficial? What are some issues you feel like you need to explore some more, or things that you feel like they're holding you back, or something along those lines. So I got a few suggestions. I'm going to come back to some of the other ones in the future. One of the suggestions was real kind of narrow and specific, so I'm going to talk about that, but I'm going to broaden it out a little bit in a more general way. In Pali and Sanskrit, there's this term nivarna or nivarana. Usually this gets translated as hindrance or obstacle. And what it's really referring to, what's it hindering or being an obstacle for? It's really referring to things that get in the way specifically of reaching a deep meditative state, sort of opening the mind in that sort of way. In order to get to that state of meditative absorption, these hindrances have to be overcome, or at least find a way to kind of temporarily set them aside, kind of deactivate them while you're engaging in the practice. There are 5 of these that are listed in a couple of different texts. The Nivarana Sutta, that's one of the main ones. It's in these are both in the old Pali canon. That one's in the Anguttara Nikaya. There's another text in that same collection called the Avarna Sutta. That one talks about the benefits that come from overcoming the obstacles. So both of those are really short texts. They're just a couple of pages long each. Each of the hindrances is presented as being a barrier to one particular quality of dhyana, of meditation, that deep meditative state. So first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to just go through them. I'm going to give you a useful, interesting metaphor for thinking about them and understanding them. And then, since the question was about one of the 5, I'll focus a little bit more on that one in particular at the end. So let me go through them first and talk about what they're like and what they're associated with, and also some kind of antidotes, some of the suggestions for how these can be overcome. So first one, kamachanda, sensual desire. Now, sensual in this case just means anything through the senses, right? So basically kind of being distracted by sort of reveling in the sensory experiences that we get through our bodies. So the specific thing that this one is portrayed as hindering is ekagrata, that sort of one-pointedness of mind, right? Since it distracts the concentration that's needed to achieve that, right? If you're sort of preoccupied with how wonderful things smell or taste or look or whatever, all this sensory information, then it's hard to keep that focus, that one-pointedness of mind. So among the antidotes that are recommended to overcome this hindrance is meditating on the decomposition of a corpse, which is kind of, the opposite extreme in terms of sort of sensual desire. Since sensuality is a fascination with the pleasures of the flesh, so focusing on sort of the opposite of the pleasures of the flesh would be kind of an obvious thing to do. If instead of you focusing on the pleasures of the flesh, you remind yourself about the more kind of foul aspects of having a body, like the fact that sexy person that's turning you on is just another future corpse who happens to be full of blood, urine, feces, spit, and bile, then the pleasure of the flesh may feel a little less enticing, kind of in that context. The second one is vrapada, malice, ill will. You can just think of it as anger, right? The hateful wish that harm will befall another person. This one, the thing that this one is portrayed as obstructing is priti, rapture, joy. Obviously, anger and joy, those are pretty incompatible emotional states, right? It's hard to imagine feeling both of those things at the same time. And the best antidote for that is something we do here, right? It's metta, meditating on loving kindness, loving friendliness. That makes sense too. If you think about the idea that if this malice is harmful, hateful thoughts, if you instead flood your mind with compassionate, loving thoughts, again, they're kind of incompatible. You can't kind of hold both of those thoughts at the same time, or it would be, unlikely to do that. The third one is styanamida. Usually that's translated as, it's usually translated with words that lots of people still don't use in their everyday vocabulary. Sloth and torpor is the most common way that's translated. Or you could just maybe call it laziness. That may be a simpler way to think about it. This one hinders the consistent application of thought, vitarka, or in other words, the motivation to kind of stick with practice, to sort of be motivated in that way. The tradition says, in terms of an antidote for that one, the best thing actually is the recollection of death, sort of focusing on mortality, meditating on your own mortality. If you remember that you're a finite creature with an expiration date, it's easier to kind of stay on task with your spiritual practice, to be motivated, right, to keep with it. Like I say at the end of every evening service, time swiftly passes by and opportunity is lost, right? And the opportunity to practice is one of the things that's lost. So, of course, the tradition also teaches that that kind of sleepy, fuzzy-headedness, just kind of taking a walk in the open air, something as basic than that can also obviously be helpful to just sort of reinvigorate, try to get awake, that sort of thing. The fourth one is, this one has a lot of syllables in Pali and Sanskrit, adatya karkirtya, right? Restlessness and worry. Agitation and regret, that's another sort of translation of that. The obstruction here is to comfort and mental ease. Sukha, to achieve deep meditation, requires some certain level of tranquility, a certain level of composure and stability. And so obviously if you're restless and worried, if you're agitated and regretful about things, then that's going to be hard to get your mind into that kind of state. That makes sense, right? It's hard to concentrate when you're frantic. That's kind of what we're talking about, a kind of emotional franticness. The antidote that's recommended for that one is to use meditation techniques that focus on tranquility, calming the mind, equanimity, those sorts of things. The tradition also suggests that associating with others to be kind of good examples and role models, especially elders, but people with a calm demeanor. If you're around, calmness kind of rubs off. If you're around people who are calm and you can sort of see how they do it, how they manage things, that can help to maintain that mental ease. And then finally, the last one is vichikitsa, skeptical doubt, right? Now, doubt has a very useful role, and in fact, in the Zen tradition, we talk about the idea that the three things you need are simultaneously great faith, great doubt, and great motivation, right? But skeptical doubt, that has sort of a different tenor to it, right? The hindrance here is to vichara, sustained thought, right? Again, it's a little related to the motivation issue. Some of the teachings compare this skeptical doubt to trying to sew with a needle that actually has a split tip. So when you're trying to sew, it kind of doesn't go between the threads, it keeps getting caught on the thread. So you can't sort of make progress with the sewing because the needle keeps getting caught because it has this split tip. The mind is constantly thinking kind of about two things. There's indecision, vacillation. The mind's kind of going back and forth, can't decide because of this doubt. I can't sort of make a commitment to a position. So one of the things that the tradition says is very helpful with that is simply studying the scriptures. That's a good antidote, since that will help you develop more confidence, more stability, feel more committed to the spiritual path, those sorts of things. The best way to understand these hindrances and why they're a problem, and what you can do about them, comes from another text, the Sangrava Sutta. That one's in the Samyutta Nikaya, a different one of those great big thick books up there on the shelf. It uses an analogy to explain, to sort of illustrate each of these things with a kind of a similar underlying idea, a similar metaphor. A number of years ago, I did a retreat at Bhavana Society, which is a Theravada monastery that's an outgrowth of the Washington, D.C. Vihara, but it's actually over in the eastern panhandle of West Virginia, over in the woods in eastern West Virginia. It's in the Sinhalese tradition. It was started by Bhante Hinapolo Gunaratana, who's written every book, has written lots and lots of books. And while I was there, specifically related to this sutra I'm about to talk about, they gave us all this little handout. I'm gonna go over this in a minute, but let me read you the text first, and then I'll relate it to this little handout thing. Before I get into this, I want to explain one thing. Last week I read and we talked about the Kalama Sutta, which is another one of these old Pali texts. And if you were here and you listened to that, or you watched the video or whatever, oh wait, no, I didn't record last week. No video of that one. But if you read that one, and if you were here, you may remember there was a lot of repetition. It was like the same phrases over and over and over again. And the reason they do that, and especially those texts, the old Pali texts, you got to remember those were orally transmitted, right? They were passed down from teacher to student for a couple hundred years before anybody ever wrote them down. So that kind of repetition of phrasing and structure was done on purpose to make it easier to memorize and then easier to remember and recite. So there's a lot of repetition. But sometimes when people translate those texts to be read in a written English form, rather than having all that repetition, they just kind of, like maybe the first time and the last time, and they'll kind of shorten it up in between to just kind of, so there's like ellipses in the text. So this particular translation I'm going to read of the Sangaravo Sutta is like that. It's sort of been foreshortened a little bit. So I'm just going to read the kind of the beginning and the end of the text and skip some repetitive stuff in the middle. So this happened at Savatthi. Then Sangarava, the Brahmin, went up to the Buddha and exchanged greetings with him. When the greetings and polite conversation were over, he sat down to one side and said to the Buddha, "What is the cause, Master Gautama? What is the reason why sometimes even hymns that are long practiced don't spring to mind, let alone those that are not practiced? And why is that sometimes even hymns that are long unpracticed spring to mind, let alone those that are practiced?" So this is the response. "Brahman, there's a time when your heart is overcome and mired in sensual desire, and you don't truly understand the escape from sensual desire that has arisen. At that time, you don't truly know or see what is good for yourself, good for another, or good for both. Even hymns that are long practiced don't spring to mind, let alone those that are not practiced. Suppose there was a bowl of water that was mixed with dye, such as red lac, turmeric, indigo, or rose madder. Even a person with clear eyes checking their own reflection wouldn't truly know it or see it. In the same way, when your heart is overcome and mired in sensual desire, even hymns that are long practiced don't spring to mind, let alone those that are not practiced. Furthermore, when your heart is overcome and mired in ill will, even hymns that are long practiced don't spring to mind, let alone those that are not practiced. Suppose there was a bowl of water that was heated by fire, boiling and bubbling. Even a person with clear eyes checking their own reflection wouldn't truly know it or see it. In the same way, when your heart is overcome and mired in ill will, even hymns that are long practiced don't spring to mind, let alone those that are not practiced. Furthermore, when your heart is overcome and mired in dullness and drowsiness, even hymns that are long practiced don't spring to mind, let alone those that are not practiced. Suppose there was a bowl of water overgrown with moss and aquatic plants. Even a person with clear eyes checking their own reflection wouldn't truly know it or see it. In the same way, when your heart is overcome and mired in dullness and drowsiness, even hymns that are long practiced don't spring to mind, let alone those that are not practiced. Furthermore, when your heart is overcome and mired in restlessness and remorse, even hymns that are long practiced don't spring to mind, let alone those that are not practiced. Suppose there was a bowl of water stirred by the wind, churning, swirling, and rippling. Even a person with clear eyes checking their own reflection wouldn't truly know it or see it. In the same way, when your heart is overcome and mired in restlessness and remorse, even hymns that are long practiced don't spring to mind, let alone those that are not practiced. Furthermore, when your heart is overcome and mired in doubt, even hymns that are long practiced don't spring to mind, let alone those that are not practiced. Suppose it was a bowl of water that was cloudy, murky, and muddy, hidden in the darkness. Even a person with clear eyes checking their own reflection wouldn't truly know it or see it. In the same way, there is a time when your heart is overcome and mired in doubt, and you don't truly understand the escape from doubt that has arisen. At that time, you don't truly know or see what is good for yourself, good for another, or good for both. Even hymns that are long practiced don't spring to mind, let alone those that are not practiced. This is the cause, Brahman. This is the reason why sometimes even hymns that are long practiced don't spring to mind, let alone those that are not practiced. Suppose there was a bowl of water that was transparent, clear, and unclouded, brought into the light. A person with clear eyes checking their own reflection would truly know it and see it. In the same way, there's a time when your heart is not overcome and mired in doubt, and you truly understand the escape from doubt that has arisen. At that time, you truly know and see what is good for yourself, good for another, and good for both. Even hymns that are long unpracticed spring to mind, let alone those that are practiced. This is the cause, Brahman. This is the reason why sometimes even hymns that are long unpracticed do spring to mind, let alone those that are practiced. These 7 awakening factors are not obstacles, hindrances, or corruptions of the mind. When developed and cultivated, they lead to the realization of the fruit of knowledge and freedom. What 7? The awakening factors of mindfulness, investigation of principles, energy, rapture, tranquility, immersion, and equanimity. These 7 awakening factors are not obstacles, hindrances, or corruptions of the mind. When developed and cultivated, they lead to the realization of the fruit of knowledge and freedom. When he said this, Sangrava said to the Buddha, "Excellent Master Gautama, from this day forth may Master Gautama remember me as a lay follower who has gone for refuge for life." So this handout, and I'll show you this, right? If you remember the bowls of water that the text talked about, right? We've got all of them represented here. We've got, this one uses the phrase sensual lust, right? For sensual pleasure, it's sensual lust. Kamachanda, right? So there's the bowl and it's full of dye and you can't see yourself clearly because there's all this activity, right? Coming from your sensual lust. And then we got dullness and drowsiness. So we've got this bowl and it's all mossy and planty and, the water can't move and it's just, you can't see clearly what's going on. Ill will is the boiling pot, right? You can't see your reflection because of all the heat of the anger, right? Restlessness and remorse is the wind blowing across the surface. It ripples and moves because the swells of all those feelings of restlessness and remorse. I'm not sure why they picked the picture they did for doubt. I don't know if you can see it, but they've got doubt. There's the bowl of water, and it's like a really complicated highway, like interstate interchange behind it. I don't know what that's supposed to be about, but anyway, that's what they did. So that's representing doubt, the unsettled, muddy, turbid water, right? And then here we have the clear water, right? The clear, serene, limpid water of the person who has calmed all these obstructions, calmed all these hindrances, and therefore has the capacity in their mind to see clearly what their kind of their true nature and so on. So so now that you know, and if you want to look at this later, you can take a look at it later if you want. So now that you know about these hindrances, you can kind of be on the lookout for these things, because these are kind of the ninjas, right? These are the ninjas that sneak up on us and try to undermine our practice. And obviously the worst thing about them is they operate inside our own minds, right? These are aspects of ourselves, in effect. It's kind of like Mara, in kind of the Buddhist writings about Mara, the Lord of chaos and death. But Mara is really kind of our own dark side. Mara's in here the whole time, right? That's the problem with Mara. And it's the same thing with these hindrances, is they're in here the whole time. That can make it harder to both notice them, but also resist them, because we sort of carry them around with them all the time. So we kind of have to acknowledge the fact that we're our own worst enemy to be able to overcome these things. Now, the question that I got was specifically about sloth and torpor, that one in particular. So let me talk about that one just a little bit more. Nyanaponika Thera, who's a Theravadan master, wrote a book about the hindrances, and that book had some specific suggestions related to the sloth and torpor thing. So here's 6 things that he said were conducive to the abandonment of that one, of sloth and torpor. So the first one that he lists is knowing that overeating is the cause of it, right? I don't know if that's always the cause of it, but I mean, it's a contributor. It's part of why I encourage folks, don't like have a big dinner and then come try to meditate. That doesn't encourage things working out that well. So that's the first thing. He talks about changing the bodily posture, right? If you start feeling sort of sleepy and groggy in the context of meditation, shift your posture, or maybe if you're meditating on your own, stand up from sitting meditation and do some walking meditation, or just sort of change the modality of the practice that you're using. Thinking of the perception of light. Maybe going out into the light would work better, but he just talks about thinking of the perception of light. Think about a bright sunny day, think about light. Staying in the open air. If you go to, in the Theravadan tradition, where they do more sort of individual practice, in some places, if you go visit a Theravadan monastery or something, you'll see they'll actually have like these stations set up where people can go out on the grounds and meditate, and often they'll have a mosquito net hanging that like tied up, and you can untie that mosquito net, kind of pull it down around yourself and sit outside, but not get consumed by the bugs, but still be able to take advantage of that being in the open air to help with staying alert and so on. The last 2 he lists are noble friendship and suitable conversation. The interesting thing about that one to me is that actually he lists those 2 things for all the hindrances, right? Noble friendship and suitable conversation. So there's a very ancient tradition of that in Buddhism. That's the importance of Sangha, right? One of the importances of Sangha is the mutual support and aid that we give each other. He also suggests the recollection of death. I mentioned that earlier, and perceiving the suffering of impermanence. He actually illustrates that with a quote, the Sanya Sutta. This is a quote from the Sanya Sutta. In a monk who is accustomed to seeing the suffering of impermanence and who is frequently engaged in this contemplation, there will be established in him such a keen sense of the danger of laziness, idleness, lassitude, indolence, and thoughtlessness, as if he were threatened by a murderer with a drawn sword. There's a similar metaphor. This is not a Zen metaphor, it's much older than that, but Zen teachers seem to really love this one, even though it comes from the early canon, which is to practice as if one's head is on fire. Right? That image is referenced. There's actually a number of scriptures that reference that image. Here's one example. This is from the Sajjita Sutta, which is also in the Anguttara Nikaya. If on examination a monk knows, I usually remain covetous, with thoughts of ill will, overcome by sloth and drowsiness, restless, uncertain, angry with soiled thoughts, with my body aroused, lazy, or unconcentrated, then he should put forth extra desire, effort, diligence, endeavor, relentlessness, mindfulness, and alertness for the abandoning of those very same evil, unskillful qualities. Just as when a person whose turban or head was on fire would put forth extra desire, effort, diligence, endeavor, relentlessness, mindfulness, and alertness to put out the fire on his turban or head. In the same way, the monk should put forth extra desire, effort, diligence, endeavor, restlessness, mindfulness, and alertness for the abandoning of those very same evil, unskillful qualities. Let me make one last point. The tradition says that the hindrances are completely eliminated in the process of enlightenment. As a person kind of goes through the steps of the enlightenment process, the hindrances are completely sort of wiped away. But I think we can probably anticipate that these will continue to be a problem that we will have to deal with. Right? This is not something that we're going to get rid of anytime soon. We can expect these are going to continue to be challenging over the course of our practice. So we should be aware of them, be prepared to deal with them. And this kind of guidance can be helpful.